In this video, I'll provide an overview of the Barbaresco region and then reveal 4 of my favorite producers for Barbaresco wines. Barbaresco is a great choice for wine collectors because these wines are very age-worthy and they can gain tremendous complexity with additional bottle age. At their peak, Barbaresco wines can be absolutely mesmerizing. Unfortunately, Barbaresco tends to be overshadowed by Barolo a bit, both because it's only 1/3 the size and because many people assume that Barolo is better. But of course, on this channel, regardless of what region you're talking about anywhere in the world, I always encourage selectivity by producer and even by vintage. And as we'll see in this video, if you do that for Barbaresco, you can get some absolutely world-class wines, many of which are even less expensive than comparable or even lesser quality Barolo wines. Better still, another great thing about Barbaresco is that the wines can typically be enjoyed a little bit earlier than their Barolo counterparts for reasons that I'll discuss in this video. The Barbaresco DOCG was established in 1980 and takes its name from the village of Barbaresco. Nevertheless, the Barbaresco region includes not just the geographic territory of the village of Barbaresco, but also all the territory in the villages of Treso and Neve, as well as a small part of Alba. The best vineyards in Barbaresco are typically planted on south and southwest-facing slopes at elevations ranging from 150 meters to 350 meters above sea level, although there are some vineyards that are planted as high as 550 meters above sea level. These locations are ideal because they allow the vineyards to have ideal sun exposure and also receive some cooling influences. The Barbaresco region shares many characteristics with the Barolo region, except that the vineyards are typically located at slightly lower elevations and the climate is slightly warmer in Barbaresco. This slightly warmer climate is significant as it means that harvest is typically a week earlier in Barbaresco, which can be important if there's fall rains approaching. This is so because one of the characteristics of Nebbiolo is that it's a late ripening grape. Perhaps more importantly, however, the slightly warmer climate also reveals itself in the glass. In many instances, you'll find that Barbaresco can be a little bit more elegant, a little bit less austere, and capable of enjoying at an earlier time than Barolo. In addition, Barolo is not quite as able to withstand some of the hotter vintages as Barbaresco. In contrast, Barbaresco typically can have a little bit more freshness and have some very impressive wines, even in some very hot vintages. The main reason for this is the presence of the Toronto River and the fact that Barbaresco receives its cooling influences during hotter vintages, whereas Barolo does not, because the influence of the Toronto River is blocked in Barolo by the Lamora Ridge. Barbaresco's slightly riper style is also reflected in shorter minimum aging requirements. Barbaresco DOCG must mature for 26 months before release, 9 months of which must be in oak, and Barbaresco Reserva DOCG must mature for 50 months before release, including 9 months of that time period in oak. There's also a 12.5% minimum alcohol by volume requirement, but that's typically not an issue. These maturation requirements add to the production costs for Barbaresco, but less so than the minimum aging requirements in Barolo, since those are longer. Barbaresco must be 100% Nebbiolo, so no additional grapes can be blended in. Nebbiolo is a black variety that's early budding, which means that it's potentially vulnerable to spring frosts that can reduce yields. In addition, Nebbiolo is also a late ripening grape, so there can sometimes be issues with this grape getting fully ripe before the fall rains hit. Wines made from Nebbiolo, such as Barbaresco, are typically pale ruby in color, with pronounced intensity of both aromas and flavors. Descriptors often include red cherry, red plum, violets, and rose. They can often have high acidity and high tannins, and they typically have medium plus to full body and a medium plus to high alcohol level. Historically, Barbaresco producers blended fruit from a number of different vineyards to create their wines. This blending can have a number of different advantages, as for example, if the fruit from one vineyard is very ripe, has a little bit less acidity, and you have fruit from another vineyard that has a little bit less ripe fruit, but impressive acidity, by blending that fruit and creating a wine, you can have a better wine than if you bottled wines from each of those vineyards separately. These classic blends continue to be extremely important in Barbaresco and generally offer the best price points and the most affordable wines. However, Barbaresco also has long had a reputation as having some extremely high-quality single vineyards. Examples include Asili and Rabaya. Like Pinot Noir, however, Nebbiolo is also capable of producing different results and also tends to reflect the site on which it is grown. For that reason, in the 1960s, top producers such as Bruno Giacosa and Angelo Gaja took a page from the Burgundy playbook and began to bottle and produce single vineyard Barbaresco wines. In 2007, there was an official system of subzones introduced within the rules of the Barbaresco DOCG. These regulations were amended slightly in 2010, and the upshot is that there are now 66 different geographic mentions or subzones that can be stated on labels of Barbaresco wines. In addition, the word viña or vineyard can only be used on the labels for Barbaresco if it's used in connection with the officially recognized MGA. On this channel, I'm always a big fan of buying wines from the best vintages for a particular region, and when you're talking about Barbaresco, some of the very best vintages for the past 50 or 60 years include 1964, 1970 and 1971, 1978, 1982, 1989, 1996, 1999, 2001, 2004, 2006, 2010, 2013, 2015 and 16, and 2019. Currently, you'll also see a lot of the 2020 Barbarescos on store shelves, and I've had an opportunity to taste many of those wines. My thoughts regarding the 2020 vintage is that whereas 2019 was very much a classic vintage, and those wines will definitely benefit from some additional age in your cellar, 2020 was definitely a warmer vintage, and so these wines are definitely much more approachable, and they're less austere, and pretty much ready to enjoy right now, if not in the next couple years. So I would definitely be on the lookout for 2020 Barbaresco if you're looking for a cellar defender, or if you're looking to enjoy a wine in the near term. With that by way of background, I'm ready to discuss my 4 favorite producers of Barbaresco wines. These are the producers with which I've had the most tasting experience over an extended period of time and have a lot of confidence in. If there's any producers that you think are worthy of inclusion as well, please be sure to let us know in the comments below. Bruno Giacosa was a legendary winemaker whose career began way back in 1961 and continued until his unfortunate passing in 2018. Since that time, his daughter Bruna has run the operations at Bruno Giacosa's winery. Bruno Giacosa is located in Nieve in the Barbaresco region, but it's equally famous for the production of high-quality Barolo. Bruno Giacosa started out operating mostly a negociant business. He didn't have his own vineyards, but he was extremely knowledgeable about all the high-quality vineyards in Barolo and Barbaresco and sourced some top fruit from throughout those appellations. He was particularly well known for the production of a single vineyard wine called Santo Stefano de Nieve, which he produced for several decades until around 2011 or so. In addition to that special wine, Giacosa also produced a number of other high-quality single vineyard Barbarescos with fruit that he sourced from the 1960s into the 1990s. But once the single vineyard movement caught on in Barbaresco, it became increasingly more difficult for Giacosa to be able to source fruit from other growers. So at that time, he decided to purchase his own vineyard sources in Barbaresco, and he got 2 of the best sources in both Asili and Rabaya. Giacosa produces both white label and red label versions of its Barbarescos. The red labels are reserved for the Reservas. These are extremely special wines that are highly age-worthy and some of the best wines produced in the entire world. Giacosa does not produce the red label Reserva Barbarescos very frequently, however. This is so because very few wines are determined to be worthy of being red label Reservas. As such, they typically only make the Reservas a few times a decade. For that reason, the Reservas are definitely much more expensive and much more rare than the white label bottlings. Bruno Giacosa is definitely considered to be a traditional producer of Barbaresco. Among other things, that means that they typically ferment the wines for 2 to 3 weeks in stainless steel at moderate temperatures, and they also mature the wines in oak casks for 3 to 4 years before they're released. I was able to visit Giacosa last November and learned quite a bit during my visit. I was able to taste both the Asili and the Rabaya, and I learned that I tend to prefer the Asili. That wine is incredibly elegant and has some floral notes that I really appreciate. Rabaya was an incredible wine too, and that one tends to be a little bit more powerful. Unfortunately, Giacosa never set aside any of its wines along the way as they were being produced, and so they don't really have much of a library program at all. So if you'd like to get back vintages of Giacosa wines, you're going to have to do it in the secondary market. It is possible to find some of these wines on store shelves in the United States, particularly the white label offerings. I've seen some 2019 Asili, for example, on sale in stores in Texas for a little less than $200 per bottle. The red label Reservas will cost probably double that if you're able to locate them. They're extremely allocated and not easy to obtain, but they are absolutely incredible wines that will be highlights of your wine collection for decades to come should you add them to your cellar. Produttori del Barbaresco is one of my all-time favorite producers. It's a cooperative that has around 50 members. These members collectively control about 1/3 of the vineyards in Barbaresco, which is certainly very impressive. While many cooperatives don't have a reputation for high quality, Produttori absolutely does. It helps to ensure high quality for its wines year in and year out through several safeguards. First, its members are required to sell 100% of their fruit to the cooperative. So they can't cherry pick and keep their best fruit to bottle it themselves under their own label. Prices for the fruit sold by the members to the cooperative are also determined annually and based on quality. Every year, Produttori del Barbaresco produces its flagship Barbaresco, which remains one of the single best values in the entire world of wine. In exceptional vintages, they also produce Reservas, and they have 9 different single vineyards from which they produce Reservas, and these are some of the very best vineyards in all of Barbaresco. People oftentimes ask me for some of my favorites, and definitely my top 3 would be Asili, Rabaya, Rio Sordo, and if I had to name a 4th, it's probably Ovello, but you really can't go wrong with any of them. These Reservas are absolutely exceptional wines. They offer extremely high quality, and they sell for around $80 to $90 a bottle. They produced them in 2019, so hopefully you can find some on store shelves now if you do a little bit of digging. One thing that Produttori does that I think is really neat as well is that when they produce a Reserva, they actually identify the names of the members that produced the fruit that went into that wine, and they put that on the back of the label. So here, for example, you can see I have a bottle of the 2013 Ovello Reserva, and on the back they actually list the members' names, and these are the members who provided the fruit that went into this wine. So definitely this is something that the members think is very important to them, and it gives them some recognition, which is definitely important since they're not able to bottle wine under their own name, given the requirements of being a member of the cooperative. So the next time you enjoy a Produttori del Barbaresco Reserva, make sure you check out the back of the label. In addition to the Reservas, of course, Produttori also produces its flagship Barbaresco. As mentioned, this is definitely one of the best values in the entire world of wine, even though the price is currently around $50 per bottle or so. My personal strategy for this wine is to load up on it in top vintages rather than purchasing it every single year. You really can't go wrong purchasing this one every single vintage, but I just find that I really like it in the strong vintages, and so I back up the truck those years. Even though I typically only buy about 3 to 4 bottles of a particular wine, for example, with 2016 Produttori, I actually bought about 2 cases of that wine. In my opinion, the Produttori del Barbaresco is best with 7 to 10 years of bottle age, although in warmer vintages, such as the 2020, which is on store shelves now, you can enjoy it certainly a little bit earlier than that, and it's also quite enjoyable with an extended decant. Cascina delle Rose is a small estate that is family owned and operated. This winery was founded way back in 1948 and released its first wines in 1952. They have around 4 acres of vineyards, or around 1.65 hectares of vineyards, and they're located ideally in Rio Sordo. They make some outstanding Barbaresco, but they only produce around 30,000 total bottles a year, including all their other wines as well. I first discovered this producer back in 2019 during a visit to the winery, and I was extremely impressed both with their operations and with the lineup of wines, and I've been a fan of this producer ever since. The Cascina delle Rose vineyards have ideal south and southwestern exposure and are planted at elevations ranging from 240 to 310 meters above sea level. Better still, these vineyards have some underground water sources, which is a bit unusual, and which also helps to protect their vines from some of the drought conditions that have existed in recent years in Barbaresco. They replanted some of their vines in 2004, but they do have some very old vines that date back to the 1950s. This is definitely a traditional producer. They like to use native yeast for fermentation, and they use large Slavonian oak casks to mature their wines. They don't use any fining or filtration prior to bottling. Historically, Cascina delle Rose has produced 2 different crus from Barbaresco, Tre Stelle and Rio Sordo. I definitely enjoy both of them, but my favorite tends to be the Rio Sordo. I've seen them selling for $70 to $80 per bottle in the United States. I've seen them at Italy, for example, but definitely shop around as the prices and vintages available definitely vary quite a bit from store to store. Interestingly, they also have access to additional fruit now, and they'll be selling a 3rd cru in the near future. This one is the Marcorino, so I'm definitely excited to try that one, but it will be produced and sold in very small quantities, so you'll definitely have to move quickly once they release that wine. Of course, you can't have a Barbaresco video without discussing Gaja. Gaja was founded way back in 1859 and is certainly one of the oldest wineries in the Barbaresco DOCG. Angelo Gaja, the 4th generation, took over back in 1961 when he was only 21 years old. Gaja has been known for its innovation, particularly since Angelo took over. In the 1960s, for example, Angelo Gaja, along with Bruno Giacosa, was one of the first producers to start bottling and releasing a single vineyard wine. Gaja's first single vineyard bottling was from the Sori vineyard, and it was for the 1967 vintage, which was released in 1970. In the late 1970s, Gaja was also one of the very first producers in Barbaresco to utilize French oak barriques that are only around 225 liters to mature the Barbaresco wines rather than the customary old Slavonian oak casks that had been used for generations. Controversially, back in 1996, Gaja also withdrew its single vineyard Barbarescos, such as Sori San Lorenzo and Sori Tilden, from the Barbaresco DOCG classification, and instead labeled those wines with the much less prestigious Langa DOC designation. This was reportedly due to the fact that Gaja was unhappy that many people began referring to their flagship Barbaresco as either basic or normale, and Gaja did not want to be known as producing anything that was just regular or basic. This change also allowed Gaja to include small percentages of Barbera in these single vineyard Barbaresco wines, and that obviously would have been prohibited if they were labeling them as Barbaresco DOCG wines, since Barbaresco DOCG has to be 100% Nebbiolo. About 10 to 12 years ago, however, Gaja stopped labeling these single vineyard wines as Langa DOC wines and removed the Barbera and once again started labeling them as Barbaresco DOCG wines. The flagship Gaja Barbaresco is produced from fruit that comes from 14 different vineyards. These vineyards span a little bit more than 21 hectares. Vineyards are planted between 250 and 330 meters above sea level, and the vines average an impressive 40 years of age. Gaja uses sustainable farming methods in its vineyards. In the winery, Gaja takes a two-prong attack to the maturation. They use the French oak barriques for the first year of maturation, and then for the second year, they'll revert back to the traditional large Slavonian oak casks. The Gaja Barbaresco typically has around 14% alcohol by volume. The 2020 vintage is on store shelves now, and I've seen it selling for around $260 per bottle, but I also saw some places selling it for well over $300 a bottle, so definitely shop around for this one. One of my best all-time experiences with the Gaja Barbaresco was with the legendary 1964 bottling. Despite its age, this bottle was still in excellent condition and showing extremely well. While I hear some people complain that Gaja is overpriced and overrated, in my view, I think these wines typically just need a substantial amount of time to distinguish themselves and show their best. In many instances, 25 years or more. So for that reason, I typically don't buy them on release, but will instead look for back vintages that I can get good deals on here and there. This approach also tends to work quite well because historic pricing was much lower than current release pricing, and so it's often possible to get some back vintages of Gaja Barbaresco with a substantial amount of age on it for not much more than you'll spend for a much more recent release. If it makes you happy to drink Gaja Barbaresco on release or within a few years thereafter, by all means do it. But in my view, I think if you're going to open it within the first 5 to 7 years after the release, you're definitely better off buying something like a Produttori del Barbaresco that sells for a fraction of the cost and which doesn't require decades before it reaches its peak. As mentioned, about 10 to 12 years ago, Gaja also began producing single vineyard Barbarescos again, and it has 3 of them: Sori San Lorenzo, Sori Tildine, and Costa Russi. These will typically set you back at least $800 per bottle, if not more. Gaja did not produce any of the single vineyard Barbarescos in 2019 because these vineyards were still suffering from repercussions from a hailstorm that occurred in 2018. As with the flagship Gaja Barbaresco, it's often possible to buy back vintages of the single vineyard Barbarescos for much less than the current pricing. This is also a good idea because these single vineyard Barbarescos require even more age than the flagship Barbaresco. Last year, for example, I tasted the 2000 Gaja Sori San Lorenzo, and it was absolutely incredible, but it was also still very youthful and nowhere near its peak. In fact, I would guess it would probably take another 10 years or so before it would reach its apex. So you'll definitely need a lot of patience if you want to buy one of these single vineyard Barbarescos on release and enjoy it at its peak. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see my companion video on the Barolo region and my favorite 7 producers from that region, please be sure to check out this video that's linked above.